I call this Beyond Survival, Unmasking Fear in high stress work. I don't need to tell you guys about the difficulty and the level of stress in the work that you do. What I really want to focus on today is looking at part of the impact and something that may not have been as obvious as one of the things that can occur. And I'm going to talk about it from a perspective of what I call unmasking fear, thus the mask that was in the beginning. So we're looking at how the high stress work impacts us, right? There is lots of things that can happen when you are going, working in high stress. There is mental overload. You probably feel like you cannot stop. You feel like, I'm actually gonna get you to raise your hands. How many of you take the work home with you? Right? We say we don't want to, but we do. And I had to tell, when I used to work as a crisis worker, my tell, for whatever reason, if I dreamt anything about work, that was my tell that work was infiltrating my life too much. And so that would be a cue that I needed to take at least a day off because it was coming too much into my daily life. But what ends up happening is, as a result of this ongoing stress, where we don't necessarily get the release that we need, we can often move into survival mode. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. The stress that we're experiencing, we may not be processing it all. Our bodies are containers for our emotions. And so if you think about how a water bottle works, pretty simple. Water gets poured in. What happens if it's not being poured out? If the water continues to get poured in, it overflows. And we're the same way. If stress is being poured in over and over again without any release, there's going to be a point where it overflows. That's where we start to see the anxiety. That's where we start to see the depression. And so we have a psychological wear and tear that can happen as a result of this ongoing stress, the psychological erosion. Lots of people have identified today that our identities can be tied into our work. And a lot of the work you do has a uniform, so sometimes it's like you put on your uniform and that's what you become. And so at the time that you take off the uniform, sometimes it's like you physically take it off, but mentally, emotionally, you don't take it off. And so what happens when the work starts to stress you out in a way that it starts to change who you are? It's like your uniform is altered, but we don't even necessarily start to realize because this process can be so insidious that we're not catching it as it goes. And so we start to have maybe a narrowing of our identity. We start to experience things so that we are looking at things from a different lens. And when we start to move into survival mode, we're so busy just trying to focus on the current thing right in front of us, we may not catch it. We know what survival mode is, right? It's a state of chronic stress. It is activated through ongoing stress. And so we know, we've heard of fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I've also recently heard now they're saying flop is another one. But think about it. When you are facing high stress, you can face the stress. You can try to run away from the stress in flight. It may immobilize you and you don't know what to do. And then the idea of fawn is really interesting because I think this is part of what happens in the survival mode, is that we're so busy trying to keep the powers that be happy. We are doing all that they say, all that they're requiring, and not necessarily looking at our own needs. So I'm really glad earlier people were addressing the fact that you've got to include you in the equation. You cannot just think about what's happening, what the organization needs, what the workplace needs. You have to think about what your needs are. One of the things that I want you to think about is survival mode can often be invisible. When we move into the state of we are doing what we need to do to get through that minute, through that day, we may not see it, others may not see it. I've heard other speakers speak about the fact that I think when Mike spoke, he said he didn't see some of the things that were happening with his colleagues. We might move into this mode and it not be very obvious. We may not notice that we're more irritable. We may not notice that we're tapping out of our emotions to move into just kind of getting done what needs to be done moment by moment. How many of you have used the expression, I just need to get through the day, I just need to get through the week? Anybody say things like that? I don't know how many times I've said that. And what I've realized is then I'm just trying to get through the week, and then it becomes a month, and sometimes it becomes a year, and the time can stretch on and on for that amount of time that we just need to get through. But when we're just getting through, are we actually really living? Are we more just surviving? And that's one of the things that I want you to think about. And as I said, I'm going to talk about what I call unmasking fear. As I said, it can be invisible. We may not even see it ourselves. We can look in the mirror and we look like ourselves and we don't realize how much has changed, how much is different. We start to operate based on fear. So I'm going to give you a quick personal example. The last full-time job that I had, I was working in a program that received so much community support. We had 2 years of funding that didn't have to come from the organization. I was hired full-time to work in the program, and all we heard about was our contributing benefactors, all the stuff that they did, and I started to internalize this concept of I need to prove I was worth the money they were spending. And so what I didn't realize right away what was happening was I was staying at work later, I was answering emails at bizarre hours, I was doing all this stuff because I was driven by this fear of I've got to prove that it was worth the money that they spent. And I didn't realize it at first. It took probably at the point where the pandemic hit and I got a phone call from my mom. My parents lived out of town, and I got a phone call from my mom that my dad was in the hospital. And somebody checked in with me later and they said, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Of course I was okay." And then I paused for a moment. I'm like, "No, I'm not." Because even with hearing that, I kept thinking, what do I have to do for work? I was distracted by what I had to do for work, which was telling me again, it was taking over. It was infiltrating too much of my thinking. And so when you're working in high stress work, and again, I cannot say enough, the level of stress, you guys know more than I do, right? I'm not a firefighter, I'm not a first responder. When we're working that type of work, we may not realize that fear is part of what drives some of what we do. One of the fears that we might experience is the fear of stopping, because you go to work and you work your 12-hour shift, and you go home and you're a mom or you're a dad, you're a sibling, whatever your roles are at home, you have all the, you might have to care for parents. There's all these things that we feel that we have to do. And so we fear what will happen if we don't keep doing all these things. And when we're in that state, the last person we check in about is often ourselves. And this is part of why we experience things like the identity shift that I mentioned earlier, is because we are tending to all these things, but we're not tending to ourselves. Survival can look like productivity. It can look like high performing in your work. And what's really unfortunate, I do a lot of speaking on burnout, is the very things that lead to burnout are often the things that the workplaces are encouraging. Rather than encouraging a healthier lifestyle, they're encouraging the overwork. They're encouraging the overextension. And so it's really important for everybody to be aware of what that looks like and to start to learn. And I'm really glad, again, somebody early talked about capacity, assessing what your capacity is. The way that I see our assessing of capacity is I ask myself regularly, what's in my gas tank? So I live here in Durham. If I were driving to, my mom lives in Niagara Falls. If I were driving to Niagara Falls, I wouldn't just get in my car and drive. I would take a look and see, do I have enough gas to get me from the point that I'm at to the point that I want to get to? Why don't we do this with our emotions and our mental capacity? Why aren't we checking, do I actually have the quote unquote gas to do this? Or am I just pushing through, especially for fear of what will happen if I don't? Fear can show up as the overfunctioning. We can be numbing ourselves emotionally. We can get into that state of, I have to control absolutely everything, for fear of it's all gonna fall apart if I'm not controlling it all. We don't even necessarily realize that we move into a place where we're feeling constant panic. As I said, all of this stuff can lead to burnout. The process to burnout can be so insidious that we don't see it coming. We don't recognize the shifts, we don't recognize the changes. If I can encourage one thing today, for sure, check in with yourself. Know what your tells are that tell you that you're not yourself. Know what your tells are that saying you're not. Do any of you see if there's been shifts in how you're functioning, shifts in how you're doing? So it's really important to be able to check in with ourselves. Because over time, we're going to do that. We're going to get into that state of vigilance. We're going to lose our ability to be flexible because we're trying to control everything. And again, that can be very fear-driven. We can become quite reactive. We may not be reflecting on things. We're just, so I need to deal with this one thing that I see right in front of me. One of the ways that this fear can shape work is, as I said, it can lead to things like overwork, extension, people pleasing. People can maybe avoid certain things, become very rigid. I have this image here with all the coffee cups, because I know I've had those days where I tell myself, oh, I can just work another hour and then I'm in my home office till midnight. So let me be honest, I also have to tell myself this stuff regularly, because I catch myself doing it with that fear of I'm not going to get it all done. We don't always acknowledge the fear, but if we don't acknowledge it, it quietly starts to dictate what we do. It starts to dictate our priorities. So we might find that maybe I'm not spending as much time with family, not realizing that fear is driving that. Fear is telling us you need to do this instead of do the family thing. Fear is telling you you need to do this instead of maybe something that's good for your physical well-being. It can change how we just navigate daily aspects of our lives. And chronic stress, we know, affects our nervous system. Our nervous systems, we are supposed to be in a state where things can go, our cortisol goes up as a reaction to something that happens. But what studies are finding more and more is what we interpret to be a threat is not what we used to understand as a threat. You know, way back in the day, I'm worried about an animal attacking me. That's an understandable threat. Now, a lot of things that feel like discomfort are perceived as threats, which means our cortisol isn't getting an option. It's not getting to drop. And I've actually been doing a little bit more studying on the effects of cortisol, and they talk about brain fog and the effects on you physically in terms of belly weight and all these other unfortunate effects of cortisol. So it's really important that we start to look at, are we living lives that promote high cortisol levels? Are we taking into our thought process ways that we can reduce it? One thing that I want to address is, and I talked a little bit about identity, is the idea about compartmentalization. This is a known survival tactic, and it's a very effective one. I'm going to put this in a box over here, and I'm going to focus on this. And in times of crisis, that can be very effective. My concern is, what if we don't come out of that state of compartmentalization? And then we continue to fragment our identities because we're putting things in boxes and we're not necessarily going back and taking it out of the box when the crisis is over. I really want you to think about that idea of, if I'm compartmentalizing, is it a time-sensitive event? Do I compartmentalize, deal with this, and then move on? Because if we don't, we disconnect more and more from who we are. When we look at surviving versus thriving, it's the awareness that bridges the two. Are we aware that we've been living in survival? And if we are aware that we've been living in survival, we now have the option to look at, what are my options to move back to a place of thriving?